Welcome back to the program. This is Bottomline Africa, right here on KTN News. Now, there have been widespread protest and condemnation since the EU Observer Mission published a report on its observation during the 2 rounds of presidential elections last year. And now the report that was released by the EU's chief observation mission in Kenya, Mariette Schaake, is now the center of attention of the European Parliament sitting in Strasbourg, that is in France. So what will the debate mean for Kenya? The report has already outlined 29 recommendations which the observers say Kenya has to implement if it has to improve its election procedures. And part of that report include strengthening independent institutions. They're also calling for, promoting democracy within political parties. They're also saying there should be some sort of an inclusive review of the electoral system to promote the participation of women and inclusivity. And last but not the least, they're calling for inclusive legal requirements. Of course, those are just some of the recommendations there by the EU. And of course, once again, Kenya was the center of attention. They were debating Kenya's last year election in their parliament today. Let's now listen into some of the contribution that was made a while ago by some of the representatives there.
Kenyan people, including 5 million young people, went to the ballot boxes last year. Their hope was to help shape the future of their country. It is deeply disappointing that political leaders and security forces traded this for dispute and division, intimidating citizens, polling staff, civil society and the judiciary ahead of the October rerun. The result is a country bitterly divided along political and ethnic lines at a time when the EU is looking at Kenya to be the engine of growth for East Africa and a partner in managing migration. We are one of the most generous providers of aid, £500 million in the current financing period, which are projects under the Africa Trust Fund. Our priority should be to use this as a leverage to support democracy and civil society in a meaningful way, not as a tick box exercise. But we really have got to ensure that recommendations made by electoral observation missions are fully implemented and are in sync with the projects we are supporting there.
There is room to build on the progress already achieved, and there is a duty to do so for the people of Kenya. Kenya can move towards more inclusive governance and more inclusive development. All communities and ethnic groups should feel that they have a role in the country's present and future. Kenyans have already decided that the devolution of powers in the existing constitutional tool to achieve this goal. Kenya has a huge potential for economic and human development. It can be a force for stability and growth in the whole region. But the only way to unleash its potential is by making Kenya's democracy stronger and more credible. And the people of Kenya can count on the European Union to help them achieve their potential.
Was just some of the contributions that were being made there by various representatives with regards to Kenya's election. Now, just to discuss this in detail, I'm once again joined by Mark Bichachi and Richard Tuta. They're both political analysts. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Yusuf. Good evening and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to Mark. And I think you're supposed to get a place in the Guinness World Book of Records. I'm going to tell you why after the show. But for now, let me just begin with some of the recommendations or some of the statements that were made earlier by some of the representatives there at the EU Parliament. Of course, this is not the official message you're getting from the EU Parliament. What they're saying is that they need to see some sort of a constructive dialogue between the two main political or the two main protagonists, that is NASA and Jubilee. Do you think this is something that can be done, provided, bearing in mind that NASA has been also talking about the same issue?
Number one, we need to understand that the issues that happened in this past election can be explained by two very easy reasons. Number one, the 60 days between the ruling and the election is a very short window of time. Number two, it happened in an environment where there was a lot of bad political will, there was a lot of political interference, not just in terms of the IEBC, but in terms of the legislature as well.
Yes.
Now, in that that background, you expect that there will be very many mistakes that would happen, not as an occasion of commission, but more likely out of omission. Now, that being said, the political stands that we have today are unnecessarily difficult if you look at them in the context of where we are as a nation. They are difficult because politicians have chosen to take hard stances, not because there are issues that are too difficult to solve. And this is what I mean. If today our politicians reached out the political divide and said, okay, what really divides NASA and Jubilee, you will find it's very little, because they agree as far as free secondary education is concerned. They agree as far as following the Constitution is concerned.
Yes.
They agree about healthcare. So they agree about everything. This is a question of our political egos being too high to settle down to do what is best for this country.
Do you foresee some sort of a dialogue anytime soon?
Well, the reality of the matter is dialogue must happen. It will happen at some point.
Well said. Speaking about politicians, and the highlight of the EU's report, Richard, is that, of course, it formed, part of the highlights of the EU report. And they're saying politicians have been intimidating key institutions. And when you talk about institutions, among them, of course, IEBC and the judiciary, do you think politicians are partly to blame for what happened during the elections, Richard?
I don't think it will be right to blame the politicians for being what they are supposed to be, because part of the allegations that have been made by the European Observer Group is that falls exactly on the role of the Kenyan politician, because we have to look at Kenyan's politicians as
Richard, does that include intimidating institutions?
Use of intimidation is a relative term. And there is to that extent that if you intimidate recognized independent institution, then you are against the law. And until such a time that somebody have not crossed that red line, we cannot say that that person have acted in a manner that it can be said that he is intimidating those independent institutions. Because some of these allegations that are intimidation, they are just opinions that are being shared by the politicians.
Yes. Mark, you're going to react to that shortly. But Richard, perhaps there's so many Kenyans who are asking why is Kenya even being debated by the EU Parliament? Perhaps can you tell us their role? Do they have any role to play when it comes to Kenya's election?
You realize, Yusuf, that one thing that is coming out clearly from the European Parliament is that if you look at what every member within that parliament was saying, you can be able to get something that it represents the foreign policy of that particular member's country. Because as it is today, you realize that even what has been said by the European Union is very different from what was said by the African Union. It's very different from what was said by the United States. So all that what we are being treated to is what I can conclude that it's a reflection of international politics. Yes.
So in other words, you're saying the EU has some sort of interest in Kenya's politics?
Yes, not interest as per se in seeing Kenyan democracy being strengthened. But remember, this is an economic bloc. So all that what they are doing currently is trying to twist maybe the Kenyan government to succumb to some of their economic interests. Because
Mark, some of the highlights, I'm sure you're going to react to that, some of the highlights of the EU report is this. They're saying that there have been a lot of people who've been being paid to attend political rallies. There was use of state resources during campaigns. Politicians have been intimidating key institutions, violence by police and civilians during the charged electoral period. This to me doesn't seem that this is a body that has some sort of a hidden interest in Kenya, because these are some of the things that were actually happening.
We need to learn as a nation that truth is not dependent on who says it. Truth is truth. Now let's look back at the elections that happened on October 26th. Number one, were there regions in this country where because of violence, people could not go out and vote? Yes, there were. Is there a letter from Akombe that said that electoral officials were putting their lives in danger in trying to conduct a poll in this country? Yes, there were. So the reality of the matter is this: the EU's intentions, not not holding. We need to get to the point where we understand that truth is truth, and we need to sit comfortably within our truth and navigate our way out of our own bad political behavior. And I'd like to correct my friend and remind him that just because something is not illegal does not mean it is right. And as a nation, we need to hold ourselves to a higher moral ground. And I guarantee you, yes, the EU will try to manipulate this for their own good.
Yes.
That is the nature of diplomacy. It's the same thing that Kenya tries to do with Uganda, and what happened with Tanzania when they burnt our chickens and cows. That being said, as a nation, we need to get to the point where we can respect our independent institutions. That if the Supreme Court says so-and-so is duly elected as president, we respect that. If the IEBC says this is the process we are going to go through, we respect that. When we get to that point as a country, we will be okay. But there are also certain issues there that we need to address as a country. And the question is this, and it's a very wide question. If a sitting president is seeking re-election and they have to fly from point A to point B and they're given state security, is that using state resources? It's a quick question you've got to ask. When the president needs to have a meeting, can he have the meeting at State House that is political, or must it only be state functions at State House? These are questions that as a nation we have to answer.
And Mark, I'm going to engage you shortly. We had a problem with your audio a little bit. But Richard, let me just pose this question to you. With all this development, we're seeing Kenya is being debated in the EU Parliament. We've seen the report that I quoted earlier that was released by the EU Observer Missions. Do you think this might bring or push some sort of electoral, sanity in Kenya?
It will depend with how far they want to go with the issue. If it is a priority on their mother country. Remember, EU is made up of it's a membership organization. Every country have its own interest within the EU.
Yes.
So it will depend with how far each country is willing to go with this issue and how much interest it have in Kenya. For instance, maybe you realize that the Germans' interest in this country is different from France, for instance. You realize that Italian interest in this country is different. So the most important thing is, are they prepared to walk a long distance? Because what we are being subjected to is equivalent to what we can say it's like a war of attrition. So are they prepared to go an extra mile? The other thing that we need to ask ourselves is that why double standard about Kenya? Because I'm very sure that it is not only Kenya that has got problems in Africa. There are other countries in Africa that have got much bigger problems than what Kenya is being treated to currently. Why is it that when it comes to Kenya now, it is a priority? Why is it that when it comes to Kenya, they are applying double standard? Why is it that they are looking at Kenya as a country from their own perspective? They are measuring Kenya using their own democratic standards, which might be right or might be wrong. Yes.
Now, Richard, for once, let's put interest, and the hidden agendas aside. Don't you think it's up to the Kenyans and perhaps the electoral body to behave?
I think we can also look at the all issues from two perspectives. There are those who will have problem with what the European Union has said. There are those who will have problem with how they have said it. But in terms of what they have said, we cannot also say that the 75-page document is totally wrong. There are some aspects that they have talked about. Because you remember, as much as the whole document is 75 page, they have also summarized it to about 13 conclusions. Like, for instance, issues to do with women participation, the issue of gender requirement within parliament, the issue of respect for independent institutions. These are issues that can now be discussed. They have also raised issues to do with the changes to electoral law, some few days towards the election. These are issues that Kenyans can come up with a Kenyan solution, not a European solution to this problem. Yes.
I understand Mark is now ready. Now, Mark, I'm sure you've heard some of the contributions made there by Richard. As much as you're going to react to that, are you foreseeing a situation where we're going to hold election, in Kenya free of any kind of problems?
You know, the funniest thing about Kenyan problems is they're both very complicated and very simple. They're very complicated for as long as we have the same political class acting the same way. And this is what I mean. If we continue to intimidate electoral officials as a country, we have a complicated problem. But if we decide to respect our institutions, which is a decision we can make today, then the problem is very simple. The real question that we as Kenyans have to ask ourselves is, are we going to reimagine and re-engineer our culture as a nation? That we need to become a people that when exams are held, we can all stand proud and say that these results of the exam are genuine. We need to be the kind of people who can say that when Parliament passes a law, we all can abide to it because we all voted for that Parliament. If that is the journey that Kenya is going to take, then we have a way forward. But for as long as we remain as a people whose opinion is only informed by the opinions of our politicians, and more specifically our tribal leaders, then we will forever be lost, no matter how beautiful a law we pass.
Now, Richard, of course, this report that was released by EU, and of course, them debating Kenya's political situation today just comes basically 2 weeks before NASA is going to swear in Raila Odinga as their people's president. One of the things NASA has been calling for is a dialogue between them and Jubilee. It's something that sentiments that have been shared by some of the representatives at the EU Parliament. Do you think this can give NASA some sort of traction?
I think nobody, if you realize that both Jubilee and NASA, they are all up for dialogue. But now the question is their agenda of the dialogue. That is where the whole problem is. But I think this report may be picked up by NASA and to form basis of the agenda of the issues to be discussed, and especially the 13 issues that have been raised in that report. Because if you look at the 13 issues that have been raised into that report, they form core of what NASA has always been agitating for. And they've also formed core of what NASA has always been saying, that these are the things that are required. They require the dialogue to rotate around. So maybe it is a plus for NASA currently. Yes.
Well, Mark, what do you have to say about that? Because these are some of the sentiments here shared by NASA as well. When you talk about dialogue, it's something that NASA has been asking for as well. Do you think it's going to give them traction ahead of their swearing in that they've been talking about?
That would be very hilarious, because one of the recommendations is interparty democracy, intra-party democracy, which again NASA itself needs to learn, because even as we speak, there's a huge fight within NASA about positions. Number two, intimidating officials of the IEBC. Again, NASA was quite guilty of this in the October 26th election. And this is why it's very critical for us as Kenyans to not look at these issues as NASA or Jubilee, but to look at them as Kenyan issues that we need to address. The mistake that we keep making as Kenyans is we subject the truth to the elements of our political parties, which never leads us anywhere. The reality of the matter, that every single person who demonstrated against people voting and stop people from voting is guilty, just as I am guilty, because I live in a country where we allowed that to happen. When I take responsibility as a person for the actions of my countrymates and begin to hold them to a higher standard, then we can begin to solve this issue. But when we begin to say and color the truth in terms of red and NASA blue, it's not going to work at all.
Richard, I think you're going to make your final comment. Now, of course, Kenya is being discussed in the international arena. EU, of course, is a big, of course, the EU Parliament is something that, Kenya has to take seriously. Do you think this will put the country in a bad light?
It depends also with the strategy that the Foreign Affairs Ministry will develop towards responding to all those issues that have been raised by the European Union. It will also depend on whether as a country we are going to take that report positively. I agree with my friend that among the 13 issues that have been raised into that report, not all issues into that report are trivial. There are those that are genuine issues. Because you will realize that in that report it has also captured issues to do with the deaths that occurred. These deaths that are alleged to have been committed by both sides in the political divide. So these are issues that as a country we can look at positively and maybe emerge out of it all being stronger than we were before. Yes.
Mark, do you think it's going to, whatever is happening at the EU, do you think it's going to put Kenya in a bad light? Because there are some of the representatives there who are comparing the 2017 elections, to what happened in 2007.
Well, there's a saying that any publicity is good publicity, and I'll tell you why it's good publicity in this perspective. That we have the European Union discussing the nation of Kenya. That tells you our importance in the international stage. The second issue to understand is this, that we live in a global village. It is always good to have external eyes look at us, and we can judge and be critiqued and know whether we are going in the right direction or not. Will this cast Kenya in a bad light? That depends on how we behave after this report. If we take the report and realize that there are certain issues that we genuinely as a nation need to address, and those are issues such as, number one, the participation of women within our political cycles. This is a critical issue. We have a law that we've been unable to implement because our political parties and our societal systems do not allow for the participation of women. Now, this is not a NASA issue. It is not a Jubilee issue. It is not an shaming issue even. For as long as we decide that as a nation, we are going to step forward, that we decide as a nation that come 2022, we're going to let the IEBC do its job. We're going to let the courts do their job. When we get to that point as a nation, then this will not be egg on face as far as the nation is concerned. This will be another stepping stone to greatness.
Everybody's longing for that day. Many thanks, Mark Bichachi, for your input. Of course, Mark is a political analyst, as well as Richard Tuta. And on Twitter, Paul, earlier we did ask you, do you think EU's parliament will help push electoral justice in Kenya? 29% of you said yes, 71% of you said no. At Alice Kemunto says, how now? Kenya